So to me, Steve, that just doesn't read like an allegory. It reads like a literal geography lesson. And I think those of us that would make our Christian brothers and sisters that make the entire 3 or 4 chapters, or some people even make the entire first 11 chapters of Genesis as all some sort of a literary device, I think we have an issue here with these rivers. Today we're in Genesis chapter 2, starting at verse 4. And before we just jump into the text, we need to explain what's going on, because in Genesis chapter 1 was an overview. It went through the first 6 days of creation. And then in here at Genesis chapter 2, starting at verse 4, it starts a slightly different emphasis. It opens with an opening, and some, especially the form critics, have said, look, in chapter 1, it moves at a high level, it moves quickly. In chapter 2, it slows down, it seems to have another introduction. So it has raised questions of some people, are there 2 different accounts? One in Genesis 1 and another in Genesis 2. I don't think so. I think it's merely what God wanted us to hear, which was to slow down and emphasize some of the things that happened on the creation day 6. So that's what we have here in this. This next section is going to slow down a little bit, and it's going to give us more detail of what happened between Adam and the animals and things like that. So any comments on that, Steve, before we jump in and read?
Because there is a style of writing doesn't mean that there is a different author. There's a style of writing where the author will mention of something that's happening in the present, and then as it goes to another chapter, he'll mention of something that's happening in the past. And that is a particular style of writing. Now, that doesn't mean that there's 2 different authors that are writing that particular book.
In Genesis 2, we have the account of the origin of mankind. We are introduced to Eve. Adam has a job, and then there's how men and women relate to each other. All that's here in chapter 2. It's very important. So, Steve, if you could start at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, and read down to verse 8.
This is the account of the heavens and the earth, when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. Now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. But a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Lord God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed.
So with this, we have God placing the man in the garden. Verse 5 tells us that there were no plants in the field because there was no man to cultivate the ground. So the perspective here was growing food. That's the assumption here, is there's no man out there to cultivate the field to grow food. Some food crops require a lot of cultivation, a lot of labor. Since there were no humans, there was no food being grown. That's the emphasis here in verse 5. And it also tells us at this time there was no rain. It talks in past tense, so it tells us this account was written years later. Traditionally, it's always been Moses that created this, who wrote the account of the Pentateuch, first 5 books, with God's divine revelation. So with this, there's no rain, but there's a foreshadowing of rain, simply because it says in those days there was no rain, but there's this mist. So with all that, Steve, the emphasis is in verse 7. So in verse 7, who does it tell us made mankind?
The Lord God formed man. The Lord there is in all caps, so that means that behind that word is Yahweh, YHWH, and so it's Yahweh, the Creator, made man.
That's the emphasis here. The emphasis is that God made mankind. And what does it say he made us out of?
He made us out of the dust of the earth.
And in chapter 3, verse 19 says, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So with that, we get some of the phrases. Sometimes they'll say at funerals or memorial services, from dust to dust. Our modern chemistry and our modern biology tell us that in humans are the same basic elements that are in all of the earth. So here it uses the word dust, but it ends up being true. Our modern science tells us we are made of the dust of the earth. We're made of the elements of the earth. Is there anything in us that's special?
Oh, yes. There it says that he breathed into us and we became a living soul or a living being. So, yeah, we have the breath or the spirit of God that makes us different from other animals.
And that's what exactly makes us different. Other than the image of God and the breath of God, we're just a pile of elements. We're just a pile of dust. We're really no different than the pile of dirt out back of the building, other than God formed us and he arranged us in a certain way and put his image in us and breathed life into us. Otherwise, there's nothing special. Because he did all those things, that's what makes us special, is we're in the image of God and he breathed life into us. That's what makes us special. Other than that, there's nothing in me that's any different from all the other elements you're gonna see. You dehydrate all of us and take away the soul and the spirit. We're just a pile of dust. Then in verse 7, it says, God made man out of the dust of the ground, then did what? What does it say he did?
He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being.
This is what the emphasis here way back in Genesis is, that the source of life is the Lord God. Other than that, there's really nothing special in us. We don't have life apart from God. Now, the other thing I think of here, Steve, is when it says here he breathed life into us. You remember there's a passage at the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 22. Jesus takes the disciples. This is after the resurrection. And in John 20:22, it says he breathed on them and he told them, receive the Spirit. So this, I think, was symbolic because they really didn't change at that point until the day of Pentecost. They weren't really renewed with power until Acts chapter 2. But nevertheless, here in Genesis chapter 2, God breathed life into them. And after Jesus' resurrection, starting the next creation, the new covenant, Jesus breathed on the disciples. And I found that to be kind of profound. The idea of God's breath is a sign or a symbol of life. There's another place I think of, if you remember in Ezekiel, I believe it's chapter 37, the story of the valley of the dry bones. And God showed Ezekiel this valley full of bones, and it says, indeed, they were very dry. And God told Ezekiel, prophesy over the bones. And the bones started coming together, and they had flesh on them, but they didn't have life until he breathed into them. God breathed life into them. And of course, that was a prophecy of the return of Israel when they'd been scattered and as a nation had died. God's going to bring them back and breathe life into them. So this idea of where does our life come from, both as individuals, as Christians, as nations, where does our life come from? It comes from the Lord God.
Our life, our sustenance, everything that we have, our salvation, all of that comes from the Lord God. So there's a lot of things that are there is that we are dependent on, we take for granted many times, or at least a lot of people do. When you become a Christian, you begin to realize some of this. You know, Glenn, you mentioned the parallel there between the breath mentioned here in Genesis and the breath mentioned over in John. We see a lot of those parallels there that have meanings that some people just read past. But what you described there is something that really, to me, gave a meaning to what God did. He breathed, gave him the Spirit, but it comes back here, I think, as you pointed out, as something that has many meaning here in Genesis chapter 2.
He breathed life into man here in Genesis 2. And that tells us that God is the source of life, and we are with him, we have life. When we are apart from him, we have death. In the next chapter, chapter 3, we're going to see death is introduced because Adam's going to sin. And at that point, He says, in the day you eat of the fruit, you'll die. So we have this contrast between God giving them life, and then in the next chapter, Adam frittering it away and ending up in death. So very clear teaching here. God is the source of life. Then the other thing in verse 8, Steve, what does it say in verse 8 that God did? What did God do for mankind in verse 8?
He put a garden there at the east and called Eden, and then he planted man there, or he put Adam there in that garden. The garden was made for him, and he put him there.
And then the very next verse, in verse 9, what else did he put in the garden?
It says that it caused every tree to grow and that was pleasing in sight, that was good for food, and there was also the tree of life there.
So God makes this garden. He puts Adam in the garden. It's full of good things. It's full of all these trees that produce all this kind of food. You don't have to go work for the food. And it tells them that it's a very good place. So that's the image here, is that he creates man, he calls man good, and he puts him in a good place that produces a lot of good things. So the image here is inescapable. It's very clear. It's very plain. Eden is a very good place. It's a very fruitful and productive place, and it has in it the tree of life. So that's the image here. It's unspoiled. It's pure. It's full of life. God and man has fellowship here. And that's the image here, way back in Genesis. And that's key. We can't lose that, because the next chapter is going to start a lot of problems.
Now, it also says there in verse 9 that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was also there. So as the story progresses, we're going to see where this tree of the knowledge of good and evil comes into play. But we see in this verse that the tree of life was there at the same time that this tree of the knowledge and good and evil was there.
Look again at verse 9. It says, out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. To me, that says that God is not only the creator, but he's the provider. He makes things that look good. He makes things that are good. It's good for you and nourishing, but it's also, God's a God of beauty. He makes things that are beautiful to look at. So this was a very, very good place. God is the provider. He provided Adam a garden that was pleasing to the eyes and pleasing to the body, and was very good. God is the provider. Does God still provide for us today?
He absolutely does. The earth that we have and everything about it, what he structured and the way that he structured it from the very beginning shows that he is not only a provider, but he set it up in such a way that it could sustain us and provide things for us, just unbelievable amounts of fish and fowl and things that can be produced so that we can have a continued sustenance here on earth. To me, it's just a miraculous thing, which it really basically is.
So I would agree. He provides great things. But Steve, there's been times in my life where I was pretty needy. And I'm sure there's people in our audience now that have a myriad of needs. So does God say that he's going to provide everything that our heart could ever desire? Or what is he really saying here as far as what is he going to provide?
I think that he's saying here that he's going to provide what it is that we need in order to live. And it's not, we have a lot of superfluous things that come about from what our heart's desire, as you put it, a lot of extra stuff that we actually don't really need to live on or by. So God is wise in that way, and he has just provided for us what we need, not necessarily what we want.
And I would agree. The other thing that's different today is that we are on the other side of Genesis chapter 3, where the problem occurs. And we'll see that when we get to chapter 3. The Genesis chapter 3, of course, is the sin of Adam and Eve. And we're on the other side of the sin here. And we then have issues with the world. God created the garden as a beautiful place that was beautiful to the eyes, good for food, and it produced a lot of things. It was a perfect world, and God is our provider. Sin happens in Genesis chapter 3, and I think we can still claim, though, that God is the provider. He is our provider. Even in a sinful, fallen world, He will give us what we need. He will not necessarily give us all that our sinful heart desires. That, I think, is one of the messages here, is God is the provider. The other thing, to just a side note here in verse 8, is it says here the garden was toward the east in Eden. So technically, according to what it says, the garden was in Eden. It's not that the Eden was the garden. So there was a land called Eden, and in this Eden was this garden. And that's where He put man. The garden was a primary focal point, and it's where we get the term Garden of Eden. But technically, it's saying there is that in the east, in Eden, is where the garden was. So the pure state here of fellowship with God was in the garden. Don't miss the point. It is a perfect garden that God provided. There's no sin yet. There's no problems. Everything is all good and beautiful. So let's go ahead and read the next section, starting in verse 9 and going down through 14. Says this: Out of the ground, the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. The bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. So we have this detail here, Steve. It's a geography lesson about the land of Eden and where the garden was. Verse 9 talks of this tree of life. And the book of Proverbs speaks metaphorically about a tree of life. It says that a handful of times. But the actual tree of life is not mentioned again until Revelation, that talks about the tree of life being in the midst of paradise, where we have fellowship with God. So this tree of life is mentioned in the first couple of chapters here in Genesis, and it's mentioned again way at the end. And as I think we mentioned in our previous session, Steve, it's clearly making bookends on the Bible. There's the garden, which is pure. It's where He made light. And in the last couple of chapters of Revelation, there's no night there. And in here, there's this garden with all these minerals and gold, and it's very pure. And there's rivers there with, river is a sign of water, and water is life. And so we see the same thing again over in Revelation. And it has beautiful stones here in the garden, and it has beautiful stones in the new heavens and the new earth. So very clearly bookends. Talks about the tree of life here, and it also talks about the tree of life at the end of Revelation. And other than those couple of metaphorical mentions in Proverbs, the tree of life really isn't mentioned except in these bookends at the beginning and the ends of the Bible. That tells me the Bible is a very designed book. It was written by God through humans, and there's 66 books written by a double handful of people, but it's all one message. Now, moving on here in verse 10 through 14, it mentions these 4 rivers. 2 of them we know about, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The other names and the lands have been lost. One of the lands, Havilah, is mentioned in 1 Samuel 15. But from this, when I read this section, to me, it doesn't read like a parable. It doesn't read like an allegory. It's a geography lesson. It tells us where these rivers are. It tells us how many of them there are. It tells us the names of the rivers. It tells us what kind of minerals are there and the quality of the minerals. So to me, Steve, that just doesn't read like an allegory. It reads like a literal geography lesson. And I think those of us that would make our Christian brothers and sisters that make the entire 3 or 4 chapters, or some people even make the entire first 11 chapters of Genesis as all some sort of a literary device. I think we have an issue here with these rivers.
Yeah, I don't know how you can make these rivers into a literary device and make some type of allegory out of them. It seems to me that you'd have to go out of your way in order to spiritualize these rivers. They're very specific. So if you were going to use them, I think as a allegory, you would just have river names. You wouldn't have all the different descriptive features about them.
I think people go out of their way to deny a lot of things. Nevertheless, what we have here, I think, is a clear parallel. As I mentioned before, there's rivers, there's gold, there's all these minerals. It's the perfect world. And we see that again with rivers and minerals and gold and perfect world in the new heavens and the new earth. So, Steve, if you could start at verse 15 and read down through verse 18.
Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. Then the Lord God said, It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him.
So here God gives Adam, or the man, he gives him a job. What was the man to do? What was his job?
He was to cultivate the garden and to take care of it.
Cultivate the garden and take care of it. Make note here, he gives Adam a job. And this is before the fall. He gives them meaningful work to do. So this tells me, Steve, that work is not a curse of sin. It's not a problem that we have to do. Work is a blessing. Work is a good thing. It's before the fall. He gives them something productive to do. It's later what he tells them is that the work's going to be hard now. But just the fact that there's work is a good thing. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And we're told in the millennial kingdom, we're that 1,000-year period of God's kingdom, Jesus's kingdom, here on earth. It's not just going to be us sitting around. We're going to have things to do in that millennial kingdom.
That's an excellent point. In heaven, in the millennium, there's work to do in the new heavens and the new earth. We're not going to be sitting on a cloud playing a harp. Why do we sometimes today view work as a curse?
I think it's just something that is in people that, hey, I have to go out and make a living. And some people actually enjoy the jobs that they have, and other people don't enjoy the jobs that they have, but they look at it as being something that's a obstacle maybe of what they want to have and where they want to go. Others look at it as a burden that they actually have to get up and go and do something every day rather than doing what they want to do. I think there's a myriad of reasons why people look at it as being a curse.
I think one of those reasons, primary reason, we're going to get to in the next chapter. In Genesis chapter 3, specifically verses 17 and 18, we are introduced to a problem, which is called sin. And with sin, God puts a curse on the ground, and it makes it difficult to produce food and difficult to get things done. That's when it becomes a problem. Here, prior to the fall, work is a blessing. So I think after the fall, it's things like work are marred, but they're not erased. Work is still, I think, a good thing. Gives us a sense of productivity. Work, we can accomplish things by working with our own hands or with our own mind. And I think we should view work as a blessing. It's in a ministry. God puts us into our jobs, our employment to do his will and to do things for him. And I think just like Adam, he'll give us meaningful things to do. Now, I think, Steve, here we probably ought to pause simply because next time we're going to get to the first command in the Bible. Is God tells Adam a command of what to do and what not to do, and he gives him one thing. He gives him one thing to do, and we're going to find out how good of a job he is at doing that one thing.
It's always that one thing that messes us up. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Please join us again next time. May God bless you.